Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming along to this. I'm reluctant to call it a forum. It's an opportunity to meet Australia's climate commissioners, to hear from them about what they've been doing so diligently over many, many months now, but also to question them directly about issues of concern that you have. Before we start, though, I'd like to acknowledge that we are conducting this meeting this morning on the traditional lands of the First Peoples of Canberra, the Ngunnawal. I pay respect to them, to their elders past and present, and to the elders of any other communities that may be here with us this morning. You'll be hearing a lot more from the commissioners as we go along this morning, but let me just introduce them to you by name. The Chief Commissioner, Tim Flannery, Will Steffen, and Leslie Hughes, Professor Leslie Hughes, Roger Beale, Jerry Houston, and Dr. Susanna Elliott. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to ask questions, and I'll brief you on how we intend to approach that in just a moment. But first, I want you to have an opportunity to meet and hear a little bit more about the commissioners, and I'm going to let the Chief Commissioner, Tim Flannery, do that. Professor Tim Flannery is well known to all of you because he's one of our leading writers on climate change. He's also, I think I can truthfully say, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. And I'm sure you remember he was a very hard-working and popular Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held a number of academic positions, including the Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organism and Evolutionary Biology, and currently he is Professor of Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. So Tim, would you like to introduce yourself in more detail if you wish, but in particular the commissioners that you've been working with?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for being here today. This really is your day, so we're going to be brief in what we say, but I do want to introduce my fellow commissioners in a little bit more detail and also tell you what the Commission's been doing over the last several months. First, our commissioners, Professor Will Steffen, who's the author of the report that you have here on climate science. He's one of the world's most eminent climate scientists, and it's been a great privilege working with him as he's developed the report over the last few months. Professor Leslie Hughes of Macquarie University, another eminent climate scientist who has special expertise in the area of adaptation and biodiversity impacts of climate science, being a very valued member of the Commission. Mr. Roger Beale, an economist, public policy expert who's been involved with the climate area for many, many years, member of the Order of Australia, who currently advises PricewaterhouseCoopers on matters of economics and policy. Mr. Jerry Houston, very prominent businessman who was recently retired as President of BP Australasia, has a very long history of, in the business community and has played a leading role, I think, as a business voice in this area. And Dr. Susanna Elliott, finally on the end, an expert science communicator, CEO of the Australian Science Media Centre, a very valued, if rather in the background, organisation which has helped tremendously in terms of getting accurate science reporting in the media. What we've been doing together over the last few months is going out to regional Australia and conducting a series of what we call consultations. We're an independent body, so we're separate from government, and our role really is to provide in those consultations expert advice and dialogue, and also listen to people in all matters of climate science. We don't comment on policy, whether it's opposition or government policy, but we focus on three particular areas. We take questions and have discussions about climate science. We also talk about the status of the international negotiations and international commitments in terms of dealing with climate change. And we also talk about the various options available to a country like Australia in terms of addressing the climate problem. It's been extremely interesting over the last few months going out into regional Australia, talking to people about their concerns. What we've found is that the audience generally represents a broad cross-section of society, from those who are rather deep green and committed to the environment at one end, through to those who doubt the climate science on the other, but with a broad middle ground. And we've found that people value those interventions. We ask people when they leave what they've thought about the intervention. We get about 80 to 90% saying that they have learnt something through the meeting and that they've enjoyed the experience, which is good to know. We also visit regional businesses and talk to community leaders wherever we go. And again, that's been very valuable for us and very enjoyable, I might say. And what surprised me is just the extent of action on climate change in almost every region we visit. It's quite extraordinary what business is doing, and particularly local government and state government, how they're leading, and federal government in these areas. Having said that and introduced the Commissioners, I will hand back to Peter to continue with the day's proceedings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Before we hear more from the Commissioners and before I brief you on exactly how we've structured this today to try and get as many areas of the debate covered as we can, I just want to hear from you. Why are you here today? I mean, obviously you're here because you care. Why do you care? What's important about this today? Let's just spend 10 minutes hearing from you before we start interacting with the Commissioners. Kate Grenfell, I can see you prominently in the front row. Why are you here today? What's important about this for you to bring you to Parliament House?
I'm one of those deep greens, I think, that Tim Flannery mentioned. And it interests me to see the range of other opinions there might be. I'm a novelist, so the problem for me is always, how can I write about this, huge problem, one that has never been faced quite like this before? Yeah. How can I write about it effectively, particularly in fiction? I don't know the answer to that, so I think I'm here to try and get a few ideas.
Okay, good. To listen to a range of views. What about the rest of you?
Oh, g'day, my name's Cindy Eretz. I'm part of the National Community Climate Movement and also the Canberra Safe Climate Alliance. I'm here because I want to know why we're not discussing the human dimension of this issue. I think the science was agreed upon 30 years ago, and I think in terms of a novel, you couldn't actually write a better novel than the whole confusion that's happened for the last 30 years.
Okay, well, we'll attempt not to dwell on the science throughout the entire forum this morning.
I'd just like to invite that perhaps all of us could step up and have a conversation about the human side and what are the barriers to this last decision being made on the price of carbon, and when will it happen so that we can actually work towards the party at the end.
Okay, thank you. We'll do our best to get into that before we wrap up this morning. Good morning. Do you mind standing and just giving us your name?
Hi, my name's Gillian. I'm part of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which has over 60,000 young members. And part of the reason I'm here is to show that young people do have a voice, firstly. Secondly, because I want to know that when I get a job in sustainable industries, I don't have to go abroad to work in an industry that I'm passionate about. And thirdly, as a current disabilities worker, I'm really concerned about the most vulnerable people in Australia and how all of the impacts of climate change and climate change policies are going to hurt my clients and are going to hurt the most vulnerable people as they deal with the environmental impacts of climate change. So I'm really grateful to the Climate Commission for the fantastic report that kept me up until 2 a.m. last night.
Okay, well, I'm glad that at least one person in the group has read it from cover to cover, and it was compelling reading, obviously. Now, talking about young people, you want to make sure that young people have a voice and that everybody knows you have a voice, and that, let's face it, this is about the future, it's about you. We've got some students in the group. One of the students, tell us why you're here. Okay, please, can we get a microphone along there?
I'm Celine Anderson from Gungahlin College.
Right.
I'm here to see what's really happening out there and what's actually being done about climate change, to take it back to the people at the school so that they can find out what's going on and not be in the dark about all this stuff.
Good. So you're a reporter today. You're taking report of this proceedings back to the school, but you basically want to know what is being done.
Yeah, and
okay.
Not just the media side of it, but what is actually being done and not what's just been blown out of.
Okay, well, you may not get a lot of political answers to your questions today, but at least you'll be well briefed, I hope, on the foundations that we have now on which to build decision making. Now, up the back, there was somebody.
Hi, I'm Roy. I'm a student at ANU, and also my wife and I run a charity for street people. So I guess we're concerned about the effects of a possible CO2 scheme on the extreme poor, if you will, in Australian society. So I'd be interested today to hear if there are any kind of alternative schemes. I'm not sort of particularly closely following the debate, but I can remember there was an Earth Hour scheme, so whether there's any kind of low-key sort of legislative move to do a kind of more formal Earth Hour, like mandatory power cuts or something like that, or something that could, along those lines, that might have a smaller effect on the extreme poor.
Okay,
in
well,
society.
Roy,
Thanks.
as I say, you may not get specific answers to questions of what we do from here, but what the Commission has considered the impact of climate change on a whole range of issues and a whole range of people. So I'm sure we'll make a point of addressing that before we finish. We've got time for one more before I move on to the next segment.
Jude Kelly. I'm interested in about social justice and business not mixing together. Has been historical from the beginning, and Aboriginal knowledge, more people being able to go back onto land and do country business and help farming at the same time.
Okay, good. Well, look, thank you very much for those questions. That gives us just a very brief snapshot of the range of views and people and groups and interests that we have here today, and it's very broad. And I think the Commission has certainly sensed that in other meetings that they've had around the country. And to give you an idea of how we're just going to approach this session today, we want to segment it to some extent, and we're going to consider what the Commission found in certain areas, impacts on health and other areas, the science and a whole range of other things. But we'll do it in segments, and I'll explain each one as we come to it. But first, as Tim mentioned, this is one of a series of conversations, we'll call them, that the commissioners have been having around the country. They're about halfway through, not quite halfway. They've already had, and they're interested in feedback. They don't want to just tell you what they've found, and they're not going to tell you what they think should happen. They tell you what needs to be done. They can't tell you what will happen from here on. But I think it might be interesting for you to hear from Tim Flannery about the kind of feedback that they have had so far in the community conversations that they've been having. Tim.
Sure. Thanks very much, Peter. I might do this from the seat. We're all probably going to remain seated from this point. But we have had 4 visits now. The first was to Geelong, where we had a very large crowd. It was a sellout crowd. And there we found that concerns were principally around, well, the changing climate in southern Australia. There was a concern about the decline in rainfall and the impacts that's having on the region. There was also, though, great interest in opportunities there for new energy development, whether it be wind, clean energy, whatever else. And this was expressed really not just in the community forum, but in the business dialogue we had. There was also concerns, of course, for trade-exposed industries there. There's a refinery we visited down there, the Shell refinery, and there was some concern about the impacts of a carbon price on competitiveness of petroleum products refined in Australia versus those that can be brought in overseas. So we had a very, very useful dialogue down there around those 3 areas. We next went to Ipswich in southern Queensland, southeast Queensland. Again, there was a real emphasis on opportunities for clean energy or new businesses, new industries. We visited there a water treatment plant, and it was just really rammed home to us the opportunities that exist there in water treatment for the whole southeastern Queensland grid, and opportunities from everything from renewable energy through to water and energy savings and so forth. That area has been hit very severely by flooding. There was questions about the impact of climate on extreme weather events, and this is covered in Professor Steffen's report. You can read more about it there. There was also concerns expressed there about the impacts of a carbon price on the lower income areas. It's an area with some significant social disadvantage and economic disadvantage, and that was on the agenda. From there we went to Port Macquarie. I was in far north Queensland filming while the Port Macquarie visit was on, but would anyone care to just give a brief overview of how Port Macquarie went?
Yeah, you all survived, obviously.
We survived. Look, there were some very interesting issues there because of the demographic. Over half the population of Port Macquarie is retired. So these people have some resources, have some time, and have a lot of interest. So the uptake of the feed-in tariff was the highest in Port Macquarie of any part of New South Wales. So we had some really interesting discussions about what this means to the distributor, the electricity distributor in that region, to have to move very quickly to a much more distributed system. On the impact side, there was a lot of interest in sea level rise because there's been a fair bit of coastal erosion in the Port Macquarie area, And again, people who have put their superannuation into having a house right on the coast are concerned about the value dropping as sea level rises and erosion occurs ever more frequently. So I think we got that nice balance of mitigation issues and impacts issues. In other words, the cost to that community of not getting climate change under control is quite significant.
And finally, we went to Mackay on the Queensland coast. Again, we had coastal issues there. Mackay faces significant impacts from rising sea level. But one of the great surprises there was going out to the Racecourse Sugar Refinery and discovering that what used to be an old farmers' co-op for refining sugar will, in just a couple of years' time, be generating a third of the electricity that's required to power the town of Mackay from clean sources, from sugarcane waste. And that's come about because of bipartisan support for a mandated renewable energy target. They were very clear about that and said that gave them the confidence to make a major investment and develop a major new industry for a big part of regional Australia. There was concern there also about the future of the coal industry, and we talked through that at length with people. But again, I think in Mackay we found a real appetite for opportunity that addressing climate change will bring. So I think that's where we are. All of them have been very, very positive interventions. People may come in somewhat wary at the beginning, think they'll be lectured at and whatever, but we've ended up having a really useful and warm dialogue, I think, wherever we've gone.
In general terms, have you been surprised, depressed? What kind of reaction have you all had to the interaction you've had directly with the community? Roger, what about you?
Look, there are some people who have eccentric views on the science and may never be convinced, in spite of sometimes Will spending 10 minutes or half an hour with them one-on-one afterwards. But on the whole, we've had a sense of 90% of our audiences saying the climate's changing, and then we need to do something about it.
But what?
But what? And are we being asked to do more than the rest of the world is doing?
Have you been... Tim mentioned that in some sense you've been heartened by what you've seen that is being done in small ways in the community. Was that a general reaction from all of you? Leslie, what about you?
Yes, I think one of the surprising things here and elsewhere is that whether or not governments act in different sorts of ways, there's lots of people in the community that are acting. There's lots of local governments that are doing a tremendous amount, especially on the coast. So in a way, it's been really interesting seeing what the grassroots is doing, either because of or in spite of what governments are doing.
So more is happening at the micro level than most of us know.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, let's move on now to some more specific discussion so that you can get a broader idea of what the commissioners have found in their considerations. And we're going to do this, I'm sorry, we are going to look at the science first because everything seems to hinge on the science. We'll look at the science, but then we're also going to look at what, if we don't do anything, what did the Commission find was likely to be the result? How's the whole thing being played out in the media? What impact is that having on the way Australia is reacting and is likely to react? And also the impacts on vulnerable people and on other sections of the community. And in each case, I'll get one of the commissioners to brief you, and then I'll give you a chance to ask questions of them related to that specific area. But first, let's just get a brief and try and get a handle on what the Commission found when it looked at the science of this. And I'll get Will Steffen to take over here and to brief you because he wrote that particular report.
Right, thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to be very brief because you have the report in front of you with all the figures in it and all the text that goes with it. But basically the title of the report reflects the key message, the bottom line message, and that is this really is the critical decade to get cracking on the problem. And that arises because we can start with the ultimate target we want, which is to limit climate change to a level with which we can cope and still have thriving societies. Now, many governments, including our own, have signed up to the so-called 2-degree target, which means we want to constrain climate change to no more than a 2-degree temperature rise in the future. Now, if you work backwards from that, that means that we basically have to get to low or no carbon economies, energy systems, and so on around mid-century. And to do that in a way which is least costly and least disruptive to society, we actually have to start making the decisions this decade to put us on that pathway. There are two basic things we need to do. We need to start steering investment decisions that are made now for infrastructure which will still be around 40 or 50 or 60 years from now, toward low carbon pathways, in other words, toward clean energy pathways. And the second thing is our emission curve is still going up year by year. This decade, it has to be turned and going down sharply by the end of the decade to give us a reasonable chance of hitting that 2-degree target. And a little bit later, Leslie's going to tell you about what may happen, what are the risks if we don't really get that 2-degree target. So then the question is, all right, well, what do we know that the science that backs up that target? Well, first of all, we know without a doubt that the Earth is warming, and it's warming rapidly. That is unequivocal. The air is warming, the sea is warming, sea level is rising, ice is being lost from the poles and from land glaciers. The IPCC used the word unequivocal in 2007 to describe that, and the science since then is simply confirmed that with ever more better observational data. Point number two, why are these changes occurring? It's now beyond reasonable doubt that human emissions of CO2, most of which come from fossil fuel combustion, some come from deforestation. This is the primary factor that is triggering the rising temperatures and associated changes in climate. That's not debated anymore and hasn't been for some decades in the reputable scientific community. There's a lot of misinformation out there in the media sometimes, but there is no debate. We know this beyond reasonable doubt. And the third thing the report says, what are the risks of climate? And there will be some risks even with a 2-degree temperature rise, but they rise sharply if we're not able to reach this target. And so the report here focuses mainly on Australia. It's not that we're the only country that's going to have risks. All countries have risks of various sorts, but of course we're most interested in what's going to happen to our own country. And there the intent was to turn the debate a little bit from the costs of doing something about climate change to what are the risks and costs of not doing something about climate change, because they very rapidly escalate to well beyond the costs we need to undertake to get this problem under control. So that in a nutshell is what the report is about. Again, the bottom line message is we got to get cracking on solving the problem this decade.
Okay, well, you must have been asked many times, probably at every community forum that you've done so far, to address the question of what makes this global warming any different to the global warming and cooling that has gone on for as long as we've known anything about the globe? And is there anything we can do to stop a process that has been inevitable since time began for the world, as far as we know?
Yeah, we've learned a lot about the natural patterns of variability, and they extend from very short-term patterns like El Nino southern oscillation, which we know very well, sometimes known as ENSO, which of course affects our rainfall and temperature, all the way to glacial and interglacial cycling, which is affected by the Earth's orbit around the sun. We actually know this really well. So we know several things now. We know that the Earth is in an unusually long warm period. We're about 12,000 years into it, and we have about another 15 or 20,000 years to go with a fairly even climate. This is important for us because we've developed agriculture, cities, modern economies during this relatively stable period of climate. That's not going to change without human interference. And the second thing is the modes like ENSO that we know very well represent redistributions of the existing amount of heat between ocean and atmosphere and around the world. We now know that we're getting additional heat at the Earth's surface from the extra greenhouse gases. That's basic physics. That physics is known very well. So there are many lines of physical evidence, observations, and process understanding that tell us that this is not natural variability we're seeing now. This is a human-driven phenomenon.
Okay, well, thank you. The commissioners were also advised by a science advisory panel, and one of those members I notice is here, Professor David Karoly from Melbourne University. David, would you like to just give us a quick reaction and perhaps give us an indication of how you felt about the sort of process that the commissioners went through?
Sure, thanks Peter, and I'd like to just agree with everything that Will said. And one of the usual questions we get as climate scientists is how can we separate the natural patterns of climate change from climate change due to increasing greenhouse gases? And the usual approach is, well, surely it's the sun, because we do know that the sun is the most important factor that heats up the Earth. Couldn't this change be due to the sun? But if it was due to the sun, we'd expect more warming when the sun is the strongest, during the daytime. But in fact, we observe more warming at night, a faster rate of warming at night than in the daytime, and that's what we expect from increasing greenhouse gases. We also see more warming in winter than in summer, and yet the sun's stronger in summer. And also, we see cooling in the upper regions of the atmosphere and warming in the lower parts, which is what we expect from greenhouse gases. If it was the sun, we'd expect more warming in the upper atmosphere and more warming of the lower atmosphere. So those patterns allow us to separate warming due to the sun from warming due to greenhouse gases. They fit the warming patterns we'd expect from greenhouse gas increases like carbon dioxide.
And was there a consensus on the Science Advisory Panel?
Yes.
There was. Okay. How many of you were there? Was it a consensus of one?
No, it wasn't a consensus of one. I think at last count there are 8 members on the Science Advisory Panel, but there was discussion about trying to get some extra scientists on the Science Advisory Panel. The chair of the Science Advisory Panel wasn't able to be here today, Matt England, but there are one other member of the Science Advisory Panel here today with me.
Okay, thank you. Over to you now, an opportunity for a few minutes anyway to question the commissioners about what they were told about science change, what their conclusions were, and what they think needs to be done in relation to the science. Would you like to please go ahead? We'll get a microphone first.
My name's Craig Cochran. We've spoken about the science, and I think I've read 98% of scientists agree. You've mentioned 90% of the people who attend the forums agree that we need to do something. So from the economist's point of view, how do we now turn this into the economic argument it needs to be, so we can work out how much it's going to cost us now, or how much it's going to cost us if we wait another 10, 15, 20 years?
We're going to come to that later in this session.
We're going to devote a segment to that, I think, aren't we? So that we can. It's obviously one of the critical questions that people want to hear addressed. So if you don't mind, we'll take that on notice. And anyone got a question more specifically related to the science?
So, sorry, Peter. Just while the microphone's been passed, I think it is important though that we do try and get beyond the the debate on the science, and actually so that we can focus on what we do. I think that's very important. And
yeah.
a lot of energy is going into the science, where in other parts of the world they're actually talking about the solutions and how we get there. So I think it is a very good question.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And as you can see, the Prime Minister's just arrived. Good to have you with us, Prime Minister. I don't want to ambush you right away, but is there anything you'd like to say, or is there anything? You've obviously had a chance to talk in private with the commissioners, but is there anything you'd like to say, or is there anything you'd like to ask the commissioners publicly?
Look, I'd just like to publicly convey the thanks I was able to convey privately when we met yesterday. A lot of great work's been done. And I said yesterday when I met with the climate commissioners that the things that really struck me out of the report was the verification of the real sense of urgency. The very title, Critical Decade, is very important, and the information in there that shows if we start now, then we can do a sort of measured sense of change over time. If we start late, then you have to do very, very dramatic changes with all of the consequences for our economy that would imply. So I think that's very important. The stuff about the Great Barrier Reef, I think particularly struck my eye as well, and people will want to look at that. It's so much a part of what we think about ourselves as a nation. And then the other thing that really struck me too is that the task is to cut carbon pollution. It's not just a question of how we store or sequester. Those questions do need to be talked about as well, and the government's got some programs to do that. But it's a question of how do we cut carbon pollution, and that's where carbon pricing comes in. So I thought those conclusions from the report were very important conclusions, and it's great to have people who can talk very thoroughly about the science, who are scientists. A good thing to see.
Well, it's been a very broad-based group. It's not a group of... I heard somebody describe them, one of my erstwhile colleagues in the media describing them as a group of pointy heads, but in fact they are a very broad-based group drawn from business, industry and science and academia. So their report does at least give us a good foundation on which to build from here. We're just in the process of discussing what they found about the science of the issue at the moment. We're going to go on and discuss much more specifically about what the consequences are if we do nothing and what possible courses of action we might take. But that's all coming up. Thank you, Prime Minister. Now, does anybody else have a question related? Yes, you.
Like to continue that conversation on other things. I'm not a scientist, but the science to me is quite simple. 3/4 of the trees in Australia and on the planet have been taken away. They're the lungs of our earth. As the Industrial Revolution has happened and all that pollution has happened, there's no trees to be able to take away all the pollution. So I agree with the Prime Minister that there's solution is really quite simple. We actually just need to replant the trees so that we can draw down the pollution and change over to the renewable economy. And from what I hear, there's actually a solution already being proposed whereby we could actually regenerate all of our ecosystems, and that would actually generate the funds to be able to transition all of our industries into renewable.
Okay.
So I'd like to know when that's going to happen.
Well, that's a possible solution, right? All right, so does anyone on the Commission want to address that?
I think perhaps we should make a point. Look, it is important that we care for the environment, replant the forests and all of that. There's no doubt that'll help draw some carbon out of the air. But there is an additional problem that what we've done since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is burn fossil fuels that have contained carbon, that have been buried in the Earth's crust for many, many millions of years. See, the carbon that's in trees cycles through the living system. You know, while the tree's alive, it's in the tree. When the tree dies and rots, it goes back into the atmosphere, and there's a balance there. But what we've done is add additional carbon to the system. And that is where the problem occurs, because the living system only has a finite capacity to draw that extra carbon down. So it's very long-lived in the system. And that's why the emphasis on reducing carbon pollution is really there, because we need to stop putting that extra, what is in effect extra carbon, into the system.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Tim. Anybody else got a... Yes, we'll take a question there and then the next one there, please. Thank you.
My name's Roger Amy and I'm a teacher, and I've been teaching this stuff for a long, long time because the data's been out there for a long time. And I have to say that the young people I deal with understand the science. They know what's going to happen in the future. What they don't understand is why no action is being taken to ensure their future. They don't understand the debate that happens in politics. They don't understand the economic debate. And when I talk to them about it, they say, but this is our future. What's going to happen to our families in 50 or 60 years' time if we don't do things immediately? So thank you for the science. It's just confirming what we've been teaching in schools for a long time, and the young people, thank you for that. What they're confused about is why the action that's being proposed to date is so minimal.
Has that been a common finding in the community conversations you've had so far? Has there been a broad how much concern is there about the science still?
Okay, I think there is some concern, but I think it's often overstated and overplayed in the media. That's our response, or our assessment of the response we've had. And that last gentleman's comment is absolutely consistent with everything we find. When we engage young people, they get the science. They get it really well. There have been no questions from young people that question the science, which says something really good, I think, about our education system. But also, it comes through very commonly, they are indeed concerned about the world they're going to have to live in 40 or 50 years down the track. So really what we're talking about, what the science is saying, is it's our kids and our grandkids that are really going to be the beneficiaries or not of what we get going this decade.
Yeah, let's go then to the young lady you're going to be reporting back to your school group. Tell us about your understanding of the science. Yes, just please go ahead. Yes, you.
What a compliment, Peter, to call me a young lady and part of a school. I'm here representing Clean Energy for Eternity and Sea Change, which is Society, Economy and the Environment, and ALSIS, which is the Australian Solar Energy Society. Clean Energy for Eternity has a slogan, 50-50 by 2020, and the solution to the climate change dilemma is 50% reduction in energy use, because our energy use is escalating every year, and that's something we need to question, the lifestyle we have. The other 50 is for a 50% increase in renewable energy. I've been to hear many, many speakers, and it's an absolute privilege to be here with the panel and to have Peter as the host.
Oh, that's only because I called you a young lady, isn't it?
And last year I had the privilege of hearing David Suzuki's solution to this problem, and he said that we need to have outdoor classrooms, full stop.
So the science for you, you've accepted the science a long time ago. You're really now, your agenda is solutions.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'd like to just go to one of the other young people present.
Could I say one more thing to that?
Yeah, quickly.
David Suzuki says to decentralise. We must get out of the cities. While we have big cities, we're in big trouble. And also, I've just completed a permaculture certificate 4, and in that course we were told the solution is permaculture. So
okay, the solution is permaculture. Prime Minister? Okay, Yes, so where can we get a microphone to? Perhaps just up there?
My name's Pablo from a group called Yarra Climate Action Now in Melbourne. So I'm just trying to understand the carbon budgeting approach. So I guess my initial question is just a quick explanation of it. And I know that the work by the German Advisory Council on global change has said 0 emissions by 2050 in order to give a 2/3 chance of avoiding 2 degrees. In their report, they split it up by country as well. And so they actually look at if every person on Earth has the same amount of carbon budget, how much each country would need to reduce. And Australia has to get to 0 by 2020. So I guess my question is, why wasn't that part included in this report? And if I guess the approach of the Climate Commission is not to have Australia, is not to call for Australia to be at 0 emissions by 2020, then I guess how are we splitting up this carbon budget globally?
Okay, yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Let me answer that. There's a very good reason why we didn't go that far in the carbon budget description in the paper, because that is not a science question. It's an extremely important question. It's an issue of equity. That's a difficult question no matter what type of climate or emission reduction approach you take, whether it's targets and timetables or whether it's budget. Hugely important question, but it's not a scientific question. The scientific question is, globally, how much can we as humanity emit between now and mid-century and still have a reasonable chance of hitting that 2-degree target? And that's exactly what the paper dealt with.
Okay, now our next question was going to come from down here. Can we just get a mic across, please? And then the next question will be from the front here.
Ian Kiernan from Clean Up Australia. We boast that we only contribute 2% of the global emissions, CO2 emissions, but we are huge exporters of coal. And we know its jobs, we know its exports, we know its company profits, we know its votes. But it is the elephant in the room that is not being addressed. And are we selling the future of this globe? I believe we are. And when you dance with elephants, you've got a fair chance of being trampled.
Okay. Well, I don't know whether there was an issue that came within your ambit, because, Roger.
Yeah. Look, we've got to face a hard fact, and that is that for the next 25 years or so, the next 30 years perhaps, coal is going to be an unavoidable part of the world's energy system. If we simply cut coal off, we would have economic and social chaos. So coal is with us. We can produce coal close to the markets that are demanding it, and we can do it in an efficient way, and it is high thermal efficiency coal, and it's generally low sulphur coal. If we don't do this, I'm afraid that China will turn, and the great powers to our north will turn to Brazil, they'll turn to South Africa, they'll turn to other places. It won't necessarily save the world. The answer is that each of those countries and ourselves have to have the incentives to move towards renewables, to cleaner emission technologies at the fastest pace that is economically and socially sustainable, and that's what we should all be encouraging.
Thank you, Roger. Now the next question's from the front here.
Hi, my name's Gene Rossetti from Wayne Swan's electorate, and I'm also a member of the AYCC. I'm a firm believer in the anthropogenic science. What I wanted to know was, is there any legitimacy in any part to any of the other theories that are bandied around? Because as much as it's important to confirm the anthropogenic theory, isn't it also important to lay to rest the other theories which are muddying the waters, so to speak?
Yeah, just very quickly, my colleague David Caroli has answered that really, really well. Because the other main theory that competes with greenhouse gases is changes in solar radiation. And I think he very comprehensively said why we can see clear fingerprints that this is a greenhouse gas signal and not a solar signal. That's the main competing theory. And I think it's been pretty comprehensively discounted, simply on the basis of evidence.
Okay, our next question comes from up here.
Chris Oughton, I'm the director of Kwinana Industries Council, and have come across this wonderful country of ours to put an industry perspective into the debate. I think the elephant in the elephant room is probably those industries that are trade exposed. We can talk about reliance on fossil fuels and how that the cost of carbon is going to be redistributed amongst the Australian community to mitigate. But what about those industries that are exporting into international markets where they have to be internationally competitive, otherwise their customers will go elsewhere? And their customers will go to countries that don't have the emission control standards that we have, that pay very, very low wages.
Well, that's pretty much what Roger's just
That's right.
addressed, I think, isn't it?
But this is a very significant part of the debate that I don't believe is coming into the discussion. I'd like to have some more to say about that a little bit later on.
Okay, now do you have a specific question on the science for the panel?
Look, I was going to say that I think probably everybody in this room agrees on the science, and we should probably move on accepting that the science is sufficiently real to be believed.
So you're quite comfortable with what you...
So let's move on to solutions.
Okay, fine. You're more interested in solutions than debating the science. So, Jerry, coal is...
Well, I'd just like to make a comment, because it's consistent with some of the media that we've seen, that people have still got deep concerns about trade-exposed industry. So, my background, I used to be responsible for Kwinana Refinery, which is one of the biggest bits of industry on in Kwinana. So, during the CPRS process, I was involved in the negotiation for an appropriate treatment to ensure that the refinery's competitiveness wasn't destroyed, through and no net gain to the world's chase for a low carbon economy. So it was, and every discussion that I've seen, either side of politics has always said that needs to be recognised. I'm hearing nothing different today. So what you're hearing, I think, in the media is a lot of negotiation that's going on. When I was running BP, we made very sure that until we got the detail nailed down, we weren't going to support any particular scheme, because it was vital, we thought, to maintain the competitiveness of that refinery through a transition period. But so I think that's why you're hearing some of that noise out there at the moment. But I've seen nothing that would make me think that anyone's going to come up with a solution that's going to wastefully throw away our competitive industries in the short term when others aren't doing the same.
Chris, we'll be talking more specifically about solutions in another segment. Look, we've got time for just one more question, and it has to be directly related to science.
Oh, well, I put my hand down after you said it wasn't about science.
Oh, okay. You withdraw.
I'll go ahead anyway.
You've got the microphone now.
Yeah. My name's Edmund Goldrick. I'm a student at Canberra High School, and people in Canberra have the highest carbon emissions per person of any city in Australia. And I was wondering, has the Climate Commission reached any conclusions on how to persuade individuals to accept some personal responsibility for reducing carbon emissions?
Okay, good. We'll probably get onto this in more detail hopefully later on, but let's quickly address it now. Did you?
Roger, do you want to say? Well, look, one of the key problems is if you ask individuals to do this, by the way, the reason that Canberra has that profile is that Canberra is the richest community on average in Australia, and greenhouse production is intimately associated with your income level. So it's not that Canberrans are particularly evil.
Wasteful?
Wasteful. It's that we live in a cold climate and a hot climate, and we're pretty well off. Now, the problem with asking individuals to solve this problem is an age-old one. It is they look out the door and they wonder, is the bloke next door doing it or not? And it's called classically the free rider problem. When you have a free rider problem like this, you don't get action unless there is a collective decision to act, and then we have put in place laws or incentives that drive us all in the same direction. Having said that, let us all encourage you to go out and find green power in the most efficient way that you can do it, to offset your vehicles, although I know my scientific colleagues worry that that is only a temporary deferral, of the emission. Do all that you can personally, but don't see that as being a substitute for sensible public policy.
So, Roger, did you come to the conclusion then that individuals probably need to be given a framework, a legislative framework, if you like,
Absolutely,
within which they are expected to operate?
They need to be given a framework of incentives and discouragement, if you like. Discouragement from consuming high-polluting sources and an incentive to consume low-pollution sources. And we're going to come round to talking about what are the best ways of doing that later on, but I think all of us would agree that that's at the nub, and we must ask individuals to be responsible, but we can't expect individuals to carry what is a social obligation.
Okay, thank you very much. But now, look, we've got to move on from the science to cover another area. I want to move on now to, we're moving on to an area I think that most of you are going to be very interested in, because I sense already that most of you here this morning are saying, we accept the science, let's talk about solutions. That's what we want. So what we're going to talk about now in this segment is the impact of climate change first, the impact of climate change and what happens if we do nothing. Okay, and I'm going to get Leslie to just lead you in on this, because this was one of the areas in which I know you were specifically interested, wasn't it? So Leslie, would you like to just take over and give us a brief here on what you found?
If climate change wasn't going to have any impact, we wouldn't really be here and we wouldn't really be worried about it. It would be just a few pointy heads like David and Will in their laboratories, in their cardigans, you know, and their computers. Sorry, they're very good colleagues of mine. But why we care about climate change, of course, is it's going to have impacts. It's already having impacts, and as an ecologist, I've been studying the effects of climate change on species and ecosystems for about the last 20 years. And one of the things we've been most surprised about is how sensitive our natural ecosystems have been to the climate change that we've already had. So in Australia, for example, we've had a little bit less than 1 degree of warming over the last 100 years. That's a little bit more than the global average. But what we are seeing here in Australia and all over the world, for example, is plants and animals actually responding to that change very, very sensitively. They're moving their ranges, their life cycles are happening earlier. You might have even noticed in your garden that some of the things are flowering earlier. Plants and animals are proving to be exquisitely sensitive to very, very small amounts of climate change. And if we think that the climate change that we've had so far is only, you know, maybe a quarter or so of what we might get over the next century, we can sort of get some idea of what might happen. Now, some of our iconic ecosystems are most at risk. The Prime Minister mentioned the Great Barrier Reef, and we probably understand the impacts on the Great Barrier Reef more than any other system. The coral reefs actually exist about 1 degree or 2 away from complete catastrophe in summer. If the temperature in the surface of the ocean is just a little bit warmer than normal, they bleach, they throw out their symbiotic algae that drives, that's their solar battery, they throw it out, and if the temperatures are maintained for any length of time, they bleach and they die. Now, we have had no bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef before 1979, and about 8 or 9 major bleaching events since that time. We're also seeing new coral diseases, and the ocean is now 30% more acid than it was in pre-industrial times. It's probably more acid than it has been for 25 million years, and acidic waters are very, very bad for things like corals that make calcium carbonate skeletons. So things like coral reefs are very, very at risk, but they're not the only ones. The Kakadu wetlands, for example, is another iconic ecosystem, very, very at risk from rising sea level. We're already seeing mangroves moving inland and replacing freshwater swamps in the Northern Territory. We've lost about 10% of our snow per decade over the last 40 years, so our alpine regions are also very, very at risk. So that's just a little snapshot of the danger to our ecosystems, but it's also human systems, our agricultural systems, human health also going to be very impacted. And perhaps I could ask Tony McMichael here in the second row, who is one of the world's preeminent experts on the impacts of climate change on human health, to perhaps say a word or two. Tony?
Well, thanks, Leslie, and thank you, Peter.
You mentioned the exquisite sensitivity of the plants and the animals, and we must remind ourselves that we belong to the animal kingdom as well as humans, and at a certain point we're sensitive as well. Now, we can reassure ourselves that at least in some respects, for a little while, human societies through culture and technology do have the capacity to ward off some of the risks. But as you've said, with a number of our plant and animal species and our ecosystems in Australia, where changes are beginning to occur, we're also beginning to see changes in some of the impacts on human communities, urban and rural, remote and indigenous in this country. And I was heartened actually at the beginning of the session to hear three of the younger speakers go straight to this point and say, look, the climate science has been well rehearsed, and we're familiar with it and we're buying it, we understand it, most people do. What we're not hearing is what will be the consequences for our society, for people, for humans.
Well, Tony, just spell out a couple of specific examples.
I will.
To give us a clear idea.
I said I will, and I'm going to mention the word will in another sense, because he and I have talked about this many times, Will Steffen, and this is an update, explicitly referred to as an update. The second chapter talks about the risks associated with a changing climate, and it identifies the very important first-order risks in the environment around us. What the next update will do, I'm sure, is carry this through to a more explicit description of the risks to human well-being and health, and basically they can be categorised into four categories. The first category we're all familiar with, and we keep seeing reference to it in public discussion, the consequences of things like heat waves, bushfires, storms, cyclones, which we're pretty sure are going to become more frequent and probably more intense, and they do a lot of damage to human well-being, health, suffering and so on. The second category we're not so familiar with involves disturbances of ecological processes that bear on mosquito populations, food production, contamination processes for food and waterborne disease risks and that sort of thing. The third category, even less familiar to us, has to do with the subtle consequences on community functioning out there in parts of rural Australia, the consequences for livelihoods, income, community well-being, mental health problems, and, of course, suicide rates. These are problems for rural communities and will become increasing risks as parts of Australia become drier. And finally, we need to look offshore and remind ourselves that there are risks to communities in the Asia-Pacific region, many of them more severe at the moment than in this country, which will destabilise and increase movements of people in this region. And we might also note that for the moment, the best estimate, and it's very conservative, is that Australian emissions would account for about 1% to 2% of the total deaths occurring around the world, almost all in poor countries, mostly in children, and our contribution at the moment is about 5,000 of those deaths offshore each year.
Right. Well, thank you, Tony. Look, just one quick question to the Commissioners before I give you a chance to feed in on this. The sort of broad working title we've given this discussion segment is what might the future look like in Australia without action? Is it possible to answer that question, given that we don't really know the extent to which the world is likely to go on warming? Can you give us a snapshot? Can you give us a picture? Leslie.
Well, it depends on what sector you're looking at, but for example, one of the major impacts of climate change is sea level rise, and most of the Australian population, about 80%, lives extremely close to the coast. We have massive investment in coastal infrastructure, and we are already seeing really significant planning issues for a lot of coastal councils, including some of the ones that we've visited. So one snapshot will be that our cities will have to simply move back from the coast. We will have to retreat. The alternative being to build sort of hard engineering solutions, so-called, which are not really solutions because they have impacts on either side. So one snapshot will be our coastal way of life in the future will be very different with, say, 1 metre of sea level rise.
Tim.
Just add a brief note to that. It's often said in the science that the sea level will rise by, say, 1 metre or half a metre by 2100. It's really important to understand that the sea won't stop rising at that point. Right? Once we've started this process, it is an ongoing thing. There's no line of retreat we can draw around the coastline to say, oh, that's definitively where it's going to stop. So it is a process which makes it more difficult to manage. And Obviously, the sooner we get on top of our emissions, the sooner we can limit the melt and the expansion of the oceans, the better off we'll be. But we do need to understand that it is an ongoing process.
Okay. Will, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one thing very briefly to follow on from what Tony McMichael has said. If we go to, say, a 4-degree world later this century, we have to remember that our bodies operate at 37 degrees Celsius. We're going to see temperatures in many of Australia's cities in the 40s and maybe even the 50s at a 4-degree temperature rise during extreme events. It's going to be almost impossible for our bodies to give off the heat that we normally do to the atmosphere around us. So I think that the health challenges of a 4-degree world will be enormous. And they're simply very direct, that we are not simply built or evolved to operate in a 4-degree world warmer than today.
Well, now, you said if we go to a 40-degree world. I mean,
a 4-degree world.
A 4-degree world. What's the probability? That's what a lot of people are finding difficult to come to terms with.
If we really fail as a global community at getting emissions down to the levels that we describe in the report, you can look at the temperature projections, and in this regard, the climate models are very good. We have a reasonable probability hitting of 4 degrees or more by 2080 or 2090. This isn't far-fetched if we don't get emissions down.
I think I can truthfully say an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist, and I'm sure you remember he was a very hard-working and popular Australian of the Year in 2007. He's held a number of academic positions, including the chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organism and Evolutionary Biology, and currently he is Professor of Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. So, Tim, would you like to introduce yourself in more detail if you wish, but in particular the commissioners that you've been working with?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for being here today. This really is your day, so we're going to be brief in what we say, but I do want to introduce my fellow commissioners in a little bit more detail and also tell you what the Commission's been doing over the last several months. First, our commissioners, Professor Will Steffen, who's the author of the report that you have here on climate science. He's one of the world's most eminent climate scientists, and it's been a great privilege working with him as he's developed the report over the last few months. Professor Leslie Hughes of Macquarie University, another eminent climate scientist who has special expertise in the area of adaptation and biodiversity impacts of climate science, and a very valued member of the Commission. Mr Roger Beale, an economist, public policy expert who's been involved with the climate area for many, many years, member of the Order of Australia, who currently advises PricewaterhouseCoopers on terms of addressing the climate problem. It's been extremely interesting over the last few months going out into regional Australia, talking to people about their concerns. What we've found is that the audience generally represents a broad cross-section of society, from those who are rather deep green and committed to the environment at one end, through to those who doubt the climate science on the other, but with a broad middle ground. And we've found that people value those interventions. We ask people when they leave what they've thought about the intervention. We get about 80 to 90% saying that they have learnt something through the meeting and that they've enjoyed the experience, which is good to know. We also visit regional businesses and talk to community leaders wherever we go. And again, that's been very valuable for us and very enjoyable, I might say. And what surprised me is just the extent of action on climate change in almost every region we visit. It's quite extraordinary what business is doing, and particularly local government and state government, how they're leading, and federal government in these areas. Having said that and introduced the commissioners, I will hand back to Peter to continue with the day's proceedings. Thank you.
Before we hear more from the commissioners and before I brief you on exactly how we've structured this today to try and get as many areas of the debate covered as we can, I just want to hear from you. Why
matters of economics and policy? Mr Jerry Houston, very prominent businessman who was recently retired as President of BP Australasia, has a very long history of, in the business community and has played a leading role, I think, as a business voice in this area. And Dr. Susanna Elliott, finally on the end, an expert science communicator, CEO of the Australian Science Media Centre, a very valued, if rather in the background, organisation which has helped tremendously in terms of getting accurate science reporting in the media. What we've been doing together over the last few months is going out to regional Australia and conducting a series of what we call consultations. We're an independent body, so we're separate from government, and our role really is to provide in those consultations expert advice and dialogue, and also listen to people in all matters of climate science. We don't comment on policy, whether it's opposition or government policy, but we focus on three particular areas. We take questions and have discussions about climate science. We also talk about the status of the international negotiations and international commitments in terms of dealing with climate change. And we also talk about the various options available to a country like Australia in
welcome to you all. Thank you for coming along to this. I'm reluctant to call it a forum. It's an opportunity to meet Australia's climate commissioners, to hear from them about what they've been doing so diligently over many, many months now, but also to question them directly about issues of concern that you have. Before we start, though, I'd like to acknowledge that we are conducting this meeting this morning on the traditional lands of the First Peoples of Canberra, the Ngunnawal. I pay respect to them, to their elders past and present, and to the elders of any other communities that may be here with us this morning. You'll be hearing a lot more from the commissioners as we go along this morning, but let me just introduce them to you by name. The Chief Commissioner, Tim Flannery, Will Stephan, and Leslie Hughes, Professor Leslie Hughes, Roger Beale, Jerry Houston, and Dr. Susanna Elliott. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to ask questions, and I'll brief you on how we intend to approach that in just a moment. But first, I want you to have an opportunity to meet and hear a little bit more about the commissioners, and I'm going to let the Chief Commissioner, Tim Flannery, do that. Professor Tim Flannery is well known to all of you because he's one of our leading writers on climate change. He's also here today. I mean, obviously you're here because you care. Why do you care? What's important about this today? Let's just spend 10 minutes hearing from you before we start interacting with the commissioners. Kate Grenfell, I can see you prominently in the front row. Why are you here today? What's important about this for you to bring you to Parliament House?
I'm one of those deep greens, I think, that Tim Flannery mentioned, and it interests me to see the range of other opinions there might be. I'm a novelist, so the problem for me is always, how can I write about this, huge problem, one that has never been faced quite like this before? Yeah. How can I write about it effectively? Particularly in fiction. I don't know the answer to that, so I think I'm here to try and get a few ideas.
Okay, good. To listen to a range of views. What about the rest of you?
Oh, g'day. My name's Cindy Eretz. I'm part of the National Community Climate Movement and also the Canberra Safe Climate Alliance. I'm here because I want to know why we're not discussing the human dimension of this issue. I think the science was agreed upon 30 years ago, and I think in terms of a novel, you couldn't actually write a better novel than the whole confusion that's happened for the last 30 years.
Okay, well, we'll attempt not to dwell on the science throughout the entire forum this morning.
I'd just like to invite that perhaps all of us could step up and have a conversation about the human side and what are the barriers to this last decision being made on the price of carbon, and when will it happen so that we can actually work towards the party at the end.
Okay, thank you. We'll do our best to get into